Thanks, Alan, and thank you for asking me to speak in such beautiful surroundings. Yeah, I find them funny as well. But you look at Regent's Park and you think, Shakespeare in the summer, it's just beautiful. And I was thinking about this talk, and I was thinking about the NICE guidelines, and this is really supposed to be light relief for yourselves after lunch. I can't quite make up my mind with regard to the NICE guideline, whether it's a Shakespearean drama, tragedy, or a farce. And you folks can enlighten me at the end of this. It's great to be able to speak to an audience of your peers, and please feel free to butt in at the end and argue with anything that I say. So what am I going to cover? Well, this started off from me sitting down in my clinical work and thinking, I know very little about psychotherapies for my patients with bipolar illness, so I better sit down and figure out what they are and make sense of them. So I'm going to cover basically going through the evidence that exists for talking therapies in bipolar illness and use an evidence-based approach, and then look at the NICE guidelines from there. So I think before we had Brexit, we definitely had the NICE guidelines for bipolar illness in the UK, because we completely threw away anything that anyone else was doing with the NICE guidelines for bipolar illness, especially the psychological treatments that were advocated for it, and they seemed to be really not commensurate with any other guidelines and not commensurate with what anyone else was doing. So what's my background? Well, I'm a psychosis researcher. I think I work pretty hard as a consultant psychiatrist in First Episode, as well as people with treatment-resistant illness. People I see with bipolar illness was about 20% of my patients in Croydon had bipolar illness, and I'd see it quite a lot. And my previous experience with this whole field was having done a meta-analysis of CBT in schizophrenia. So caveats to this is not me saying that psychological interventions aren't needed in bipolar illness. Of course they're needed. It's just me being very critical of the evidence as it stands and from what people have said in regard to the evidence. I think when you look at issues with regard to the evidence for any guideline, these are the main issues to my mind. Your control group, a lot of older studies were done with treatment as usual groups as a control or waiting list controls. Of course, you're going to show an effect. If someone's been waiting for something for 9 months and you give it to them, you're going to see an effect. With regard to blinding of raters, if you know that someone is receiving an intervention, you're unconsciously more likely to rate that as a bigger degree of improvement. That's what we saw with CBT for schizophrenia. When you had non-blinded assessors, there was no difference in symptoms and symptoms ratings, and that's fairly much there in the literature for everyone. Researcher allegiance, if I am this great charismatic individual doing a trial, like the Wunderink trial and the rest of them, well, I'm going to show an effect. That might not extrapolate to this intervention being done throughout the world, unless I'm like Santa and I can go around the world at one time, That's just not going to happen. And the final thing there is outcome measures. So if you're going to be measuring anything, please, you'd have thought you'll just have your primary outcome measure as opposed to lots of secondary measures and composite measures at the end. So those are the things that were in my mind when I'm looking at evidence, and I'm looking at evidence in regard to psychological therapies. This is nothing new to you folks. You do it all the time. You've been doing it thoroughly in your careers all the time when you evaluate evidence. So I just went roughly through all the psychotherapies I could go through for bipolar illness. They seem to strap on to psychoeducation, cognitive behavioral therapy, family-focused psychotherapy, and interpersonal social rhythm therapy. Psychoeducation, it's been around the longest. It's got a pretty good evidence. So what do you do when you're looking for evidence? I thought I'd find a good review. I know the authors of this review. I've always rated their work very highly of Dr. Anderson, so I thought, I'll go through the review, look at the literature, make sense of it. You look at it, it goes through individual and group psychoeducation. We know what psychoeducation is. It's essentially psychoeducation about the illness, substance misuse, medication concordance, things that you just do in your general clinical life. What did they find in their review? Well, pretty much wide heterogeneity amongst individual studies as opposed to group studies. And the way of making sense of it was to look at attrition rates, so conservative. If you're looking at relapse rates, you would say, well, if everyone relapses, that's one outcome, and if everyone doesn't relapse, that's another. But if it holds true for both, you can generally say that it's going to be working for people. So they looked at relapse prevention, psychoeducation, in individual and groups. And what do they find? Well, when you look at them both together, you're decreasing the odds of a manic relapse. And no one's going to really disagree with you on that. And that's the studies that they've put together when you combine them all. And versus treatment as usual, placebo, you can say any relapse, it seems to come out just as significant there, more so for manic as opposed to depressive relapse. So you can say group psychoeducation sounds reasonable. You stick it into a number needed to treat. That's a good number needed to treat to prevent relapse at 60 months, 4 to 8. So yeah, that sounds like a reasonable intervention. It covers most of the things that we've covered there before. So next up, cognitive behavioral therapy. So for acute treatment of symptoms, predominantly depression, where did you find the evidence? Well, it was in NICE, and when I read the NICE table, I thought, that's quite reassuring, that sounds all right. You got an effect size of 0.3, it's still small, but it's there. And yeah, it sounds reasonable, and it's maintained at 12 months. So the face validity of that, it's okay. So maybe that works for acute symptoms. And for relapse prevention, really, whenever you're reading through any study, you're always going to go for the biggest randomized controlled trial. Jan Scott did the biggest randomized controlled trial, relapse prevention, for preventing relapse with CBT. In multi-center trial of about 300 people at 18 months, they found nothing with the primary endpoint. She was so clear in the data, there was a hazards ratio of 1.04. So no change for CBT, 22 sessions, versus treatment as usual in preventing relapse. A post hoc analysis, people who'd had 12 episodes were less likely to get an effect of CBT. Those that had less than 12 might have had an effect. But these are post hoc analyses, and she was very clear when she presented it and when the data came across, saying, hey, big randomized controlled trial, biggest of its kind, we haven't found anything. Moving forward, what the other types of psychotherapies I could come across? There's something called functional remediation, which is a group psychotherapy focusing on generally functioning activities of daily living, much as you see in the schizophrenia literature. Only one big study, but that's a pretty big effect size, a Cohen's d of 0.93. And in terms of other therapies, there's family-focused therapy. Again, when you look through the evidence, I couldn't find good reviews on it, but when I read through it, everyone seemed to have their own little different type of family-focused intervention. There was no great clarity on it. And what I did find was that they compared all of these at the end, so I'm going to come back onto that. So looking through the evidence of family-focused therapy, so many different types of study, so many different types of outcome measure, you can't really make sense of that literature. The final one is something called interpersonal and social rhythm therapy, which I guess makes intuitive sense. And a lot of this does. It's a lot of what we tend to do in our clinical practice. But essentially making sure that people's diurnal rhythms are looked at, bit of behavioral intervention there. And again, good hazards ratio, almost 3 times the effect when you're looking at this intervention. And again, that's probably, this is an inspirational person who's doing it for the first time. So you could think about it in acute depression. How did I make sense of it? Well, I didn't make sense of it. The field made sense of it. The field said, you have all these disparate types of therapies. Well, let's put them together and let's see how helpful they are. So to do that, you need an adequately powered study, big sample population, multi-center. They did that with STEP BD, and people were randomized to 30 sessions of either CBT, family therapy, or interpersonal social rhythm therapy, versus 3 sessions of collaborative care, which is essentially, it's probably worse than treatment as usual, to be fair. And what did they find? Well, shorter time to recovery in people receiving an intervention, but I think the most important thing is what they found at the bottom there. It didn't matter what type of intervention you received. They all seemed to have some beneficial effect. So it didn't really matter whether it was CBT, family therapy, or interpersonal social rhythm therapy. People seemed to make a reasonable recovery. Hazard ratio 1.58. That's quite good. And you'd say, yeah, that sounds sensible. And what's this? What bird's this? Yeah. And for me, that sort of says, just as a jobbing psychiatrist, it's the dodo effect. Any intervention of a reasonable quality given to a population tends to have an effect, but no one intervention or therapy seems to have a more significant effect. And that's been described in the psychotherapy literature for years. So it brings me on to the NICE guideline from 2014. And this was the psychological treatment for bipolar disorder. Now, NICE split it into illness phase, so acute treatment, and relapse prevention. And they also went on to say a lot of other things. And to be honest with you, I'd gone through the literature. I then came across the NICE guideline because I thought, this is nice. I pay my taxes. I should be, getting into this. And I read it, and the recommendations, we'll see what you make of the recommendations, but it did annoy me. And it annoyed me enough to just go through the literature and drop a line to one of the editors of a journal and say, we've re-reviewed the literature, and there doesn't seem to be an evidence base for the NICE guideline. See what you make of it. We were fortunate enough that they published it, and I'll let you know what the sequelae from that were. So, the first bit of advice, and it's unfortunate the way that they write some of the guidelines, because you read it and you're sitting there going, do they really think I should have to do this? And they're very didactic, should be offered. You have to do this. And for commissioners, as a lot of you know, when you're commissioning services, you have to follow this guidance to get paid. So, excuse me while I read out from a slide, because I think this is priceless, actually. So for bipolar depression acute treatment, people should be offered a specific intervention for bipolar disorder which has a published evidence-based manual or a high-intensity psychosocial intervention, and they give examples. Interpersonal therapy, CBT, behavioral couples therapy, don't know where that came from, that's got to be a typo, in line with the guideline on depression. Okay. And they also said, in primary care, your first-line treatment for bipolar depression should be one of these. It shouldn't be anything else, as in keeping with the guideline on depression. They then said family therapy should be offered for everyone living close to family. Okay, that sounds sensible. And a structured intervention to prevent relapse for individuals or a group. And that could be manualized. Okay, so going back through that, making very clear statements, actually. Acute depression, these are the treatments that we say should work because they work in depression. And first-line treatment for bipolar depression should be one of these. And this is the evidence upon which they based it. So this was the evidence, one of the meta-analyses they did for depression, and the one that gave the effect size of 0.31. And it looks really impressive if you look at the first two there. But what do you folks, now if I take you through it, you've got your study, fair enough, your assessment point, end of therapy, fair enough, number of trials that they've included, and then the effect size. So a negative effect size showing a beneficial effect of the treatment. And those are treatment as usual. What do you folks think of the two studies that they included with active controls? They definitely showed an effect. It's just that people got worse to a higher effect size than the people got better with the treatment as usual studies. So reasonable quality studies with an active control, people with bipolar depression seem to get worse. It's only an N of 1, it's only one trial, but that's pretty interesting, isn't it? And those are proper effect sizes, 0.4 and almost 0.5 is at least fairly reasonable. So what did they say about psychoeducation? Well, they conducted 2 meta-analyses with 2 trials and found no great benefit on symptoms. That's fair enough. And they didn't see much from that. But then they said for family psychoeducation, it's beneficial because post-treatment, you can see some sort of effect. But that wasn't kept, really, to 12 months. And they based it on that. However, the meta-analysis they did included only one trial for family-focused intervention for psychoeducation there. So you've done a meta-analysis of one trial. Okay, we'll come on to that. So that's methodologically rigorous. So going on to relapse prevention. So we've covered what they said about acute treatment. Let's look at relapse prevention. And remembering what I'd said about, a quick Google going through it, biggest studies been negative. So I read this with interest. So individual CBT for treatment as usual against any relapse, it actually showed an effect, which I was going, well, that's brilliant. I don't know how that is. So what they tend to do in all these documents, it's like any policy document you've had to go through. The appendices are sort of hidden in the inner reaches of the inner web of the internet. You can't really access them. And you've got to press lots of buttons and everything else. And I eventually found the appendices for the studies. And they excluded the biggest trial of CBT for relapse prevention. So I'm thinking, okay, well, all right. So we decided to just reanalyze it, stick it in. And you could argue, it's probably underpowered and it's got some effect on risk ratio, but it's not really. And this is our reanalysis there when you put them together. And I think the important point is the biggest study has been a negative study. And you can't really make up your mind much on relapse prevention there. And we said that. We said that in the article. So, acute treatment, not really sure what's going on there. Really not sure what's going on with what you're saying about relapse prevention. Tell you what, let's look at your methodology. My research is generally imaging. And the one thing that made us all pretty embarrassed was when people took the comparison testing we would do for our imaging, took a dead salmon and subjected it to the same comparison testing we were doing for our imaging and found that you had activations for the dead salmon. All right? So, that was embarrassing for all of us. And it's a lesson in controlling for multiple comparisons. However, when you go through the NICE document, they've conducted over 130 separate meta-analyses. Some meta-analyses have only one trial, and up to about 200 outcome measures from one trial. Just random measures. And there was no control for multiple comparisons. Now, you could argue Bonferroni is very strict, but you could at least do a false detection rate, and you should have some caveat to your control for multiple comparisons. And something I haven't put up or tried to explain, because I still can't explain it, is that they did composite meta-analyses of all these different treatments. So they'd add in one trial of interpersonal, with one trial of CBT, with one trial of psychoeducation, and suddenly come up with an effect on some measure, but only report the ones that they got a significant finding in, as opposed to all the others. So those were issues that made us scratch our heads and made us think of risk of bias. To be fair to NICE, and I have to be fair because, we've got to be fair in life, they did say that all the studies were very low to very low quality in terms of being able to rank them. Though they didn't say that when they gave you the evidence-based statement and told you what to do. So the other thing that I thought might be happening there with risk of bias was selective reporting, because they didn't report all the findings from the composite meta-analysis. So they reported just the positive ones that they had. So what happened from there is we got in touch with Lancet Psychiatry and said, look, we've just got an opinion piece here. It might be absolute rubbish. Let people read it. If that's okay, see what they make of it. They can contribute. And then someone got in touch with, it's a great blog called The Mental Elf. And Guy Goodwin wrote on the Mental Elf and went through it as well and gave it his seal of approval, saying, the man's worked in bipolar illness for, 30 years? 330 years. 300 years, apologies. And, gave his opinion that it seemed to make sense. And he didn't understand what was happening with the bipolar group, really, with what they said. So what happened after that? Well, there was a webinar, which Alan was on with some people from the NICE guideline group. It's amazing that when you're wrong, no one really admitted it. I admit it all the time to my patients. I admit it in my research. If you do psychiatry for long enough, you're going to make loads of mistakes, and I think that's just part and parcel of what we do. It happens in science. It happens everywhere. It didn't seem to happen with the NICE group. So I got a wee email, actually, from the editor of the journal saying they're not very happy. I said, oh, really? No, Sherlock? But basically they gave a very detailed response, and they gave a 4-page, I think it was 4-page or 4 columns. The first page, and this is a nice guideline committee replying to what we had said, and the first page basically said there is no conflict of interest. We have no conflicts of interest. No one here has ever had a conflict of interest, which I thought was very impressive for a scientific journal, for everyone to know there was no conflict of interest for anyone on the committee. The next bit they said was, we didn't include the Scott study, and we didn't include it because people were in episode at the time. So if you're looking at an intervention to prevent relapse, if they're depressed or manic at the time, you shouldn't include it. And I thought, that sounds fair. They said in regard to the multiple, let's go back, or it's not letting me go back, that's fine. But in regard to the multiple comparisons, they said, we took something out of a statistical book and said, essentially, you need to look at more than one outcome measure if you're going to look at causality. So, we've looked at lots and lots of outcome measures, and that's absolutely fine. And that was their argument, essentially. So they let us know there was no conflict of interest. They let us know that they listened to lots of people, listened to lots of survivors of bipolar illness, and in terms of the science, they excluded Jan Scott's study because people were in episode, and that it's okay to look at lots of outcome measures. And that all sounds fine, but when you go back, and let's see if we can go back here, and you look at all the studies of relapse prevention, it's unfortunate that out of all the studies that are included, 2 other studies that they have included had people who are currently depressed or manic or hypomanic. So we wrote that back, and we didn't really receive a response to that. And then with the outcome measures, well, the same book says, you shouldn't be looking at more than 20 outcome measures without making a control for multiple comparisons. That's a rule of statistics. It's a very simple rule of statistics. And what were we left with? Well, I think we were left with the fact that when you look at it, when they were composing the evidence, I think they started with what they wanted to say as opposed to the evidence. So they started, essentially, with what they wanted people to do. If I could get this one. Sorry? Oh, that would be intelligent, though. I don't want to be doing that. I think they started with this. I think they started with what they wanted people to do. And unfortunately, they maneuvered the literature to sort of reflect that. And I think that was just really unfortunate, as opposed to anything else. Because these guidelines are going to be used for clinical commissioning. We all work in pretty cash-strapped services. In Croydon, I think it's not an open secret. I think they're on special measures. And commissioners, they don't, as David Taylor was saying, they don't really get psychiatry. So they'll do whatever they're told to do with the guideline groups. And it's just pretty unfortunate, really, that I think when they were thinking about their evidence, that came after the big message that they wanted to put across. So a bit of light relief for you folks. I think we all pay our taxes, and that's a bit unfortunate as well, because NICE is a publicly funded body. And I think, and I hope, in the future that when people put together these, and I've sat in a guideline group, I hope in the future when they put things together, they do sit and have a wee think about what the outcomes are going to be, because it's going to come back to bite you. Thank you very much.
Right, okay, so we're open for questions. Just a comment, if I can disagree with you slightly, Samir, about the STEP BD program, where you showed that collaborative care versus the other groups, which are IPSRT, FFT, and CBT, and so on. Now, they were all better, but the collaborative care wasn't that much worse, and it was 3 as opposed to 30 sessions. So it wasn't really, it didn't control for therapist time or anything like that. And if you actually look at the outcomes, although there was 10% of the time, there was probably about 80% of the effect, really. But anyway, that's just...
No, absolutely, yeah.
So any other points? Question there?
Do you have any idea how much guidelines actually implemented to the clinical practice?
Good question. Actually, it's better answered by the head of the NICE bipolar guideline, who wrote a piece saying that they should be implemented throughout. I think implementation of psychological treatments is pretty poor generally. But funding isn't. Because if you look at psychosis, they've funded a lot, actually, for psychosocial interventions. So the money attached to it is quite a lot. Which is why this is also, important, I think. Well, why I think it's important.